Critical Thinking. I'm Professor Borrowdale, and we're continuing with these informal fallacies. Last time we were talking about argument by analogy and the ad hominem. Just to review, like we talked a lot about like the statues and Confederate monuments. And so just to review, just make sure everybody's completely clear on the argument by analogy. Let's see, get back to our regular page. That's not it. There we go. So you think about understanding an argument by analogy or trying to analyze somebody else's argument, you think about, well, what are you doing? Well, you're saying that your opponent has to be consistent. And you start, here's the case that everybody will agree on. And that exhibits this quality of being just or unjust. It illustrates this principle that people have a right to a certain thing, or people don't have a right to do a certain thing, or it's appropriate or inappropriate. And we say, here's a case just like it, this case I'm pushing right now. And so you have to see that these two cases agree that they're the same in important respects. Therefore, this quality that you impute to the one case carries over to the other case. You disagree with the Holocaust, then you disagree with the abortion Holocaust, right? You think you should take down a statue of Robert E. Lee, you should tear down a statue to Plato. And this goes on a similar argument, argument by analogy, closely related is this sort of argument called the reductio ad absurdum. Sometimes just called the reductio argument. And the reductio argument, you show that, and often this is an argument by analogy. So you say, I'll use P and Q. Let's see. Maybe I'll do this on the next page. Yeah, maybe I'll see if I fit in here. If P then Q. Not Q, because it's absurd or something like that. Therefore, not P. So it kind of looks like the what argument form? Modus tollens, excellent. Yeah, so it looks like a modus tollens, and but the idea is that anything that implies an absurdity or a contradiction can't be true. So if I believe a certain thing, like, I could have a belief like, I'm trying to think of something where I'm not going to step on people's toes. Nope, that one won't work. No, that one won't work. Suppose I believe that my friend Bill is a reliable source of information, and that whenever I'm looking for I have a thorny philosophical or metaphysical problem, I talk to Bill, and so I have this principle that Bill is reliable, and then you talk to Bill and you find out that Bill believes in unicorns and all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories. So then the idea is if Bill's reliable, then unicorns exist, right? Or if Bill's reliable, then 9/11 was an inside job or whatever. He has something that you just think is beyond the pale and you don't accept as being reliable. So then therefore you have to conclude that Bill's not really reliable. Right. So, and usually it's not the absurdity is is some kind of hypothetical case. So you could say, and it's closely related to the straw man, which we'll talk about today. With a reductio, you could say, we'd say these like, okay, the Confederate monuments thing. So if you believe that you should take down a statue of Robert E. Lee because Robert E. Lee supported slavery, well, Plato supported slavery. There's a big statue of Plato in Athens there. He wrote about slavery in the Republic. He also supported like military conquest and the politics of empire, and it had a lasting effect, all up until the modern age. So why don't you take down his statue, right? And the idea is that, well, if you wouldn't take down Plato's statue, then you wouldn't take down the statue of Robert E. Lee just because he supported slavery. So that's an example of a reductio argument. Now it's also argument by analogy because you're comparing the two cases and saying this case is analogous to that case. Or I could say, you say you should take down a statue of Robert E. Lee. Well, because he's a racist. You say, well, Woodrow Wilson is a racist, and then, but would you take down a statue of him? Now, there's actually people that want to take statues of Woodrow Wilson down for precisely those reasons. There's students organized at Princeton to remove him from the college, even though I think he was its first president. No, he's a president. I don't remember. Anyway, he's an important person at Princeton. So the idea is if you wouldn't take down statues of Woodrow Wilson, or if you wouldn't dismantle the Jefferson Memorial. Jefferson was a slave owner. Washington was a slave owner. Lincoln, although he freed the slaves, he had some prejudicial attitudes towards African Americans. He had the idea that black people were inferior and they should all go back to Africa, right? So you think about so then the question, this raises a larger question, like when you look at monuments to historical figures, do you evaluate them by modern attitudes and sensibilities, or are you taking into account that they're a product of their time, or that human beings are imperfect and they all have flaws, and then you just look at what were they being honored for, right? So like Andrew Jackson's a great example. So so I make a reductio argument. Let's see. If you believe Robert E. Lee's statue should be taken down, then you hold the general principle that any person that support that. Now the question is, what does that say? Is it because just of slavery? What about something else that's bad? And it seems like, again, argument by analogy. If you say, well, here's a guy that supported the Confederacy, which was built on slavery. Well, what about a person that supported genocide? It seems like that's a similar thing, right? So if you're, now this is the question, which is worse, supporting slavery or supporting genocide? It's a tough question. You think genocide's worse because you're killing people based on their race as opposed to merely enslaving them. Now, enslaving them is bad enough, right? But the question, would you rather be a slave or would you rather be dead? Some people would say, some diehard, I suppose, freedom people will say, I'd rather be dead. But so would you rather be? So it seems like genocide is worse than subjugating people by their race. So Andrew Jackson waged genocidal wars against the Indians, wiped them all out, forced them to move, and slaughtered. His policies, and him personally too, he fought in wars against the Indians. He wanted to wipe them out and take their land. He's on the $20 bill. Maybe he should go off the $20 bill. And people say, well, he's a president. Well, is there that much difference between like being a president of the side that won and being the president of the side that lost? Right? Jefferson Davis, I guess, right? So that would be the analogy. General Washington, the slave owner, General Lee, the supporter of the Confederacy, which also supports slaves. I don't know how many, whether Mr. Lee in particular owned slaves, right? But just because he's a general for the Confederacy and the Confederacy has institutionalized slavery, does that necessarily make him a symbol of evil or like a representative of slavery? If you asked Lee, he'd probably say he is representing, his homeland and his brethren and against the war of northern aggression, right? So he'd say it's all about state sovereignty, and not necessarily not particularly about slavery. And I think that was general sentiment of the South. And there's lots of other things going on in the Civil War besides slavery, including like economic things. So slavery is part of the economic system of the South, but you had like the agrarian South, which is all based on agricultural exports, and you had all the political power in the more urbanized and industrialized North, which were all about imports, right? So there was a big fight over that too, and that some people argue that was more important than the slavery issue, which is sort of a surface issue. If you look deeper, you have more enduring economic or cultural attitudes having nothing to do with slavery. But leave that by the side for a minute. So you have, the question is, do you do all this stuff because, what's the opposite? It hurts people's feelings. But then you think about, again, what about Che Guevara over there in the Students First building? Does he have to come down? What about like people wearing Che Guevara shirts on the street? Suppose I'm a Cuban, right? Maybe I survived the Cuban Revolution. I'm like a old retired dude, and I see some college student walking down the street with a Che Guevara shirt on, and he like murdered my grandfather or something, or my father, right? That's gonna upset me. So by argument analogy, it causes you to think critically about like cases and not think about them as isolation, but think about them as sort of like a bigger case. And so and try to figure out, okay, well, you make a judgment about this particular case. What about this case? What about this case? And the idea in the argument, you want to show, like if you have a certain point of view, you want to show, oh no, that's more like this case that you agree with as opposed to that case. So, and in the reductio argument, let's come back to that for a second. The reductio ad absurdum, it's Latin for reduction absurdity. You try to show that this person's view implies something that is absurd, that it represents some general principle that no one will accept. So it's kind of, you think about it, it's kind of like an opposite by argument by analogy. And I actually haven't thought about it this way, but I think this is a good way of looking at it. So argument by analogy says, here's a case everyone would accept. Here's a case just like it. You need to accept that too. Here's a case where there's this quality, and I want you to move this quality from this case that you accept to this case that you're not sure about. Now, in the reductio ad absurdum, you're kind of do the opposite. You say, okay, here's what you believe, and here's a case that nobody accepts. Your case is just like this case that nobody accepts, therefore you shouldn't accept it either, right? So that's a similar thing, because like most people would say, dismantle the pyramids, take down statues of Plato, chisel, celebrate diversity into the Arc de Triomphe. Just fill in the blank that people will say that's ridiculous. Who would do that? And I'd say, what your idea of taking down all the Confederate monuments, implies that because of the general principle on which it's based, which is get rid of historical figures who were have racially prejudicial attitudes, or in any way support slavery, or fill in the blank, or maybe are like morally bad people. So I'd say in that case, if your standard is if you're a morally bad person, you shouldn't have a monument, I'll point at the Dr. King, who did great things for civil rights and was a plagiarist and adulterer, not exactly like a moral role model, and may have been also lived pretty high on the hog with donations to his cause too, and lived in fancy hotels and drank fancy scotch and had nice suits and lived pretty well compared to the people he was representing. Now again, there's feet of clay, right? It's hard to find anybody. You can point to anybody, a person of greatness. They all have foibles, right? So then the question is like, what's bad enough? And it gets you to think about things sort of as a whole instead of thinking about individuals in part and focusing on them narrowly. Questions about argument by analogy or the reductio argument? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, never mind, okay.
Okay.
It would just reopen that debate.
So it's
With the
called ad
statutes.
absurdum?
Yeah.
That's what
Reductio ad absurdum, which means
Okay.
reduced, sometimes just the reductio argument.
On Moodle, would it be possible to put like a list of
Yeah, I'll
words
have
that we
this.
just need to know?
Yep.
Ooh,
I'll
that
have,
would
like,
be-
I put a handout the last time on like the logical argument forms and a summary of what we did in class. I'll do that again at the end of the week here. And burn the candle at both ends. Okay, so we've been talking about the ad hominem. This, I would say, is particularly in the age of identity politics, which seems like we've been talking about a lot in class here, because it's been in the news. In the age of identity politics, the ad hominem is like one of the most pervasive fallacies that you can find out there. And people will say, you know, as a blank, you know, I object to blank. And so this idea that who you are depends on whether, you know, I suppose when you say I object to blank, which usually means blank is illegitimate. As a woman, I object to any laws that say that say I can't do whatever I want to my own body. As a person of color, I object to Confederate monuments. You know, and sort of, so the idea is that what group membership you're a part of should determine your stance on this, on any position. As an Armenian, I object to how the Armenian genocide is being pushed under the rug, and I object in the strongest terms the use of the Young Turks as a name for a progressive podcast, right? So the idea is that whether it might like upset me emotionally. This goes back to the emotions versus reason thing. It might upset me more emotionally if someone names their podcast after the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide around the World War II era. But does that affect like whether it's appropriate or inappropriate in an objective sense? And like, why is it even relevant to a public discussion? I'm just kind of like, I might be venting my spleen, but I would urge you to avoid like you bringing your identity into an argument when it's not really relevant, because it's not, you can't attack a person for who they are and ignore their argument. And in other ways, you shouldn't push your own argument on the basis of who you are. Your own argument should stand and fall on its own merits. And the same way, if you're analyzing an argument, you should ignore who's making the argument and instead address the argument in its own terms. So I said, you can see the ad hominem fallacy in the most easy way when you see somebody just says, I make an argument about like the Armenian genocide, and somebody says, well, Borrowdale, you're just saying that because you're an Armenian. And then I come up, I ask my friend Sally from Sweden, and she says the exact same words. Does the argument change? No, it's just, it's the same argument, and it stands or falls on its merits. It doesn't matter whose mouth it comes out of. So that's the easiest way of looking at the ad hominem argument. You're attacking a person in a way that's irrelevant to their argument. Now, when is who's making the argument relevant? When is a person's character relevant to an argument?
If they're known for lying?
Yeah. So if they have a reputation for dishonesty, you'd want to like check up on their facts. And if maybe they're not. Let's see. So a person's character is only relevant for, say, on matters of honesty and reliability. Especially in expert testimony. Or I think we left off of this last time. And this goes with appeal to authority. So when you have a person giving, when you're consulting authority, here you got this. It's only relevant to when it has to do with the person's honesty or their reliability, and in I'll just put "and" in expert testimony because these can be separate. So when you're consulting authority, or you're doing like eyewitness testimony, right? So someone gives testimony in court, and they say, "Yeah, I saw my best friend, and he was shot 5 times in the back by the police," right? Well, you probably want to take into account, with the reliability of that witness, that he was best friends with the person that was gunned down. And if all the other people at the crime scene said, "Oh no, he charged the officer," then this one guy who says that it happened another way, that will give you all the more reason to discount his testimony. But even the fact that a person has a sort of an interest, and this is just dealing with eyewitness testimony, right? You want to look at that. And that speaks to reliability. Now, if this person has had a history of maybe they have some perjury convictions, that would also be way against them. Now, if they got some traffic tickets, right, that's not going to be relevant to whether or not they're a reliable person or not. So when you're dealing with appeals to authority or experts, you want to make sure they have a good track record. So there's, I'll just put, well, first of all, there's their credentials. Who are they? Credentials. And one thing to consider with appeals to authority is that anybody can start like the whatever institute. The, you have a person like, Mary Brown from the Stop Gun Violence Now organization or something like that, said that our children are in danger of being shot every day. School children have a 1-in-4 chance of being shot before they finish the 12th grade, something like that. Now, first of all, that's an absurd statistic, and you should always look at the statistic. But you look at who is Mary Brown? She's from the Stop Gun Violence Now coalition or something like that. What is that? Well, it's a bunch of people that want stricter gun laws, and they got together and they fill out some paperwork for the government. Is she a sociologist? Does she have any credentials or degrees? Oh, she's CEO of Stop Gun Violence Now. So it's an activist group, right? But she doesn't have any particular expertise on gun violence just by making herself president of some activist group. So you want to make sure the person has some credentials. If they're offering expert testimony on gun violence and they're not quoting some authoritative statistic, you don't want to just take their word for it because, they're from the Stop Gun Violence Now coalition. They must know something about gun violence. Well, not necessarily. And that even might be a reason to be suspicious of them.
So there are actually occasions where people's credentials can work against them. Like if someone denies climate change and they're working for the ExxonMobil Foundation, you might want to call that into question.
Yeah, that's and
like negative credentials almost.
So you want to say who's funding the research. I'd say it's important to be even-handed about that too. So if someone's from the Climate Change Institute or something like that, right, or from the Green Coalition of scientists and scholars or something like that, it's you look at institutional support for ideas. It's important to look, not just say, if it's the oil companies, it must be biased, but if it's from if it's from some progressive think tank, it must be, they must be objective, right?
Everyone's biased. You just got to filter through it.
Yeah. So there you want to look at, like, who are their credentials? Are they experts in the field? So you might get a person who's an expert, say they have PhD after their name, but they're not an expert in the thing that they're speaking about. And here it gets, I suppose, a little bit muddy. You have personal experience, like people say, like Dr. Laura Schlesinger was this radio advice person, and she had a doctorate, but her doctorate was in exercise physiology, so she actually didn't have a degree in psychology, I think, when she started. And then eventually she got like a master's in social work, which is a counseling degree. But when she just first started out, and she was just good, well, your mileage might vary, right? But she seemed to be good at giving advice, and you might argue that, like, over the years she gets personal experience in dealing with people's problems and kind of learned on the job. But like the doctor and Dr. Laura Schlesinger, you know, she might be good as a personal trainer, but as far as credentials goes, offering psychological advice might be, you know, she doesn't have credentials for that. The other thing you might ask yourself is this a case where expert testimony helps you? Let's see. Well, let me put in one more thing. So let's put whether they have an axe to grind. And this looks a little bit like the ad hominem, but the thing is, when you're looking at expert testimony, it's completely relevant to ask, like, who is this person and where are they situated in this issue, and do they have an interest in getting you to go one way or the other? It doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't pay attention to them. So there's this group, like there are groups about immigration, like the Center for Immigration Studies, or the Federation of American Immigration Reform. So these are groups that want to limit immigration, and they put out studies that show that the immigrants are a net drain in the country, and particularly immigrants from poorer nations, and then they lay out carefully done studies. And you might look and you think, well, this person's against immigration. Are they exaggerating the economic impact of immigration from third world? Are they downplaying, like, the benefits of immigrants, particularly illegal immigrants? And then you could look at the studies, but the thing you don't want to do is just say, oh, they're like an anti-immigrant group, and just dismiss what they have to say. So it's kind of, the idea is that you might have some suspicion, you might want to look at them look at them carefully. But the thing is, if you see something from some other group, like I think about, okay, so there's like immigrants' rights groups. And what I see commonly amongst students is they'll say, oh, that's like these one set of groups, these are like the anti-immigrant groups, and then here's like the I don't know, some pro-immigrants' rights groups, and they quote it like it's gospel, and they have no axe to grind either. But these people want to increase immigration, and they want the government to look the other way with the illegal immigration. So both sides have a bias, and just keep that in mind when you're looking at the information. You want to ask, like, who's this person? What is their ideological bias, if any? And take that into account when evaluating it. And then the last thing, which is, are there experts in this area? I would say, like, in things like, what might be, well, I just ask this as a question, where might there be issues where there might not necessarily be experts, or where experts aren't maybe going to help you out as much as some other areas? Philosophy, maybe. I'll say, so in philosophy in a certain way, so I would say there are experts in, like, the history of philosophy, and there might be experts in critical thinking. So the experts is a certain, the experts happen as, expertise takes a certain form, right? So, for example, you might consult me as someone for understanding like, you know, what the ad hominem fallacy is. But whether, just because, say, I teach a class in critical thinking, doesn't mean you can show me any problem and then whatever answer I tell you is the one you should accept, right? Because I'm a really good critical thinker. And that's the way people often operate. They're like, okay, I got a problem, who's the authority? And then I ask them like, okay, Mr. Authority, what is your ruling on this? And they tell you answer, and they just uncritically accept it. So you don't want to do that. You know, Socrates is famous for saying there are no experts in virtue, right? There's no experts in morality. So I might tell you about like some of the theories about morality and ethics, but the idea is you have to make up your own mind about ethics and morality. And it's different from something like plumbing, for example, right? So there are people that study have special expertise in plumbing and can help you out if you have a plumbing problem and are going to be probably better at fixing it than you. The same thing about like an auto mechanic or a physicist, right? So there are areas of expertise, or a doctor, right? Those are professionalized things, or a dentist, right? If you have like a cavity, you don't want to like go to like, you know, your friend who says, oh, I can fix it in my garage, I get some tools and, you know, I'll fix you up, right? That would not turn out well, even if he offers you a really low rate. But if someone offers like some moral advice, you don't say, oh yeah, well what school of morality did you go to? Where are your credentials, right? There's no schools of morality. You can get a degree in like religion and ethics, I think, from some places, and you can get a philosophy degree and specialize in ethics, but there aren't any real experts in ethics. In the same sense, they're experts in these sort of technical fields like repairing complicated devices and you know, computer programming, medicine, law, right? If you want like legal advice, you get a lawyer and it's going to cost you like $300 an hour, right? It's super expensive. Why? Because they have expertise. Well, there's nobody you go to for moral advice for $300 an hour, right? That's going to be any better than like consulting a trusted friend. Okay, so there's some guides on looking for appeal to authority. So an appeal, there's the fallacy of appeal to authority here. Pen. So there's there's a fallacy called appeal to authority. And that's just appealing to authority that's illegitimate, appeal to authority where authority isn't relevant, just doing the opposite of all these things we said you should do. Appealing to authority who isn't really an authority in the field, who's an authority in something else but not in this particular field, or appealing to someone that you know has like fake credentials or questionable credentials. So all those cases. So are cases where if you do the opposite of these things, you're committing the appeal to authority fallacy. So not all appeals to authority are fallacious. Expert testimony and various authorities are important parts of evidence for arguments. It's just that you have to be careful about which authorities you're appealing to. So the field, let's just say, occurs when you do the opposite of a previous slide. So when you so if you say you know, smoking cigarettes is perfectly fine, I just saw a report from the Tobacco Institute that said my risk of cancer is negligible, right? That would be the appeal to authority fallacy. I got my new I got my new QVAR bracelet. It gives out healing waves of quantum energy. And, you know, Milton Jones from the Quantum Healing Energy Institute certifies that it produced, you know, 5 gluons of quantum healing energy per hour, which is what you need to stay in maximum health, right? So, and you look at there's like no, you know, there's no such thing as quantum healing energy that uses sciencey words, but really this is just some like quack healthcare thing, right? So be careful when consulting experts. Who is the expert? You know, where do they get their credentials from? Is this legitimate science or pseudoscience, and so on? Do they have an axe to grind? And you know, and is this a place where experts are even helpful, or whether they're recognized experts? One of the a controversial area actually is psychology. So that psychology is a vast and disparate field. But when you deal with like clinical psychology and counseling, there's lots of studies that show that so-called talk therapy doesn't do any better than confiding in a trusted friend or minister. So if you look at people that have a problem, and also people that do the talk therapy, they say, well, I went to therapy and I got better, but they do control where they have people that didn't do the talk therapy, and their problem, they took care of their problem some other way, and they got better too. So this is just kind of like the people that they get a cold and then they like pray to God for healing, and lo and behold, in 7 days they're completely cured, right? Well, what would happen if you just, you know, laid in bed for a while, right? Same thing, right? So, so that's something to consider too. Okay, so appeal authority. Straw man. Anybody know what the anybody know what the straw man fallacy is? It's very
Where you're
common.
attacking an argument that the person hasn't actually made, like, I don't know, there's lots of examples, I can't think of any of them.
Misrepresenting someone's argument to make it easier to attack it.
Exactly, you're misrepresenting a person's argument to make it easier to attack it. And it comes from, it's a metaphor from jousting. So when you would learn to joust, they would like hang like this man made of straw on this little gizmo where it like he'd sort of hang there, and it was on kind of like a rotating wheel. And you go down with your lance, and you'd, you know, on jousting practice, and you'd impale the straw man that's just sort of hanging there, right? He's not gonna fight back. He's not trying to poke you with his lance. He's just hanging there. And the idea is that it's really easy to attack a straw man instead of like another knight. So the straw man, you can impale the straw man, which is a gross mischaracterization of your opponent's argument, instead of attacking the real argument. So this is the mischaracterize. Oops. You mischaracterize your opponent's argument. In order to more easily defeat it. I'll read an example here. This is from 2011. This is fall 2011, before campaign season. So my plan says we're going to put teachers back to work in the classrooms, construction workers back to work, tax cuts for small businesses, tax cuts for hiring veterans, tax cuts if you give your worker a raise. That's my plan. Then you got the Republicans' plan, which is let's have dirtier air, dirty water, less people with health insurance. So far, I'm feeling better about my plan. This is President Obama campaign speech, starting out early, October 17, 2011. a whole year before the election. So my plan is, we're gonna put teachers back in the classroom, construction back as we're at to work. We got tax cuts for small businesses, for hiring veterans, tax cuts if you give your worker a raise. That's President Obama's plan. What's the Republicans' plan? Dirtier air, dirtier water, less people with health insurance. So you imagine like you go to like GOP.com, grand old party. You think, what's the Republicans' plan? Check this out. And you say, you know, dirty air. Plank number 2, dirty water. Plank number 3, no health insurance. Now, how much you want to bet if you went to GOP.com and look at the Republicans' plan, that's what you would see? Right? You're not going to see that. Okay, maybe it's like, maybe confuse them with another party. Is there some other like political party that's campaigning for dirty air, dirty water, and less people with health insurance? Nobody believes this, right? This is like a totally made up campaign platform. Now he's mischaracterizing Republican plan. So it may be that the Republican plan calls for easing restrictions on industrial pollution, right? And you could have a discussion about that. But it's unfair to say, oh, what the Republicans want is dirty air, as if anybody wants dirty air, right? Or Republicans want to pollute the water that they have to drink. Or that the Republicans love taking away people's health insurance or making sure people don't have it. I think there was some ad. Who was that? I think they had this ad where it was a political ad where there was like an old lady in a wheelchair being pushed off the cliff by some Republican, right? So it's like, so that's how you win elections, right? By demonizing the other side. But it's not fair to argue in those terms. So the idea is that to argue against this is really easy, right? So you make your opponent look like they're crazy, and you make yourself look like you're sensible. And so, do you want vote for me, and I get this sensible plan? I got tax cuts, right? So I'm not like an extremist. I'm kind of like this centrist Democrat. Or there's the Republicans that want to like pollute your air and water and take away your health insurance. Which one of those you want to pick? Well, it's like an easy choice, right? So that's a good example of the straw man. Can anybody else think of another straw man that you've heard recently? It's a comment that you might pop up sometime. You just sort of grossly. It's similar. It's similar to the. Yeah, go ahead.
President Trump bringing up Colin Kaepernick's the kneeling for that national anthem.
What did he say?
That kneeling for it's unpatriotic and you should be fired basically, but it had nothing to do with what Colin Kaepernick, why he took a knee had nothing to do with what Trump is assuming.
Well, his idea is so it's during the national anthem, and his idea is that America is a country with institutionalized racism, and so when the national anthem is played, he's going to take a knee in protest of the racist country he lives in. So it's so there. The question is, I don't know what President Trump said specifically about what he was doing, but he said anybody I think Trump says he's disrespecting the anthem and the flag. And I suppose the question is that a mischaracterization of like what he's doing, or an exaggeration of it.
I mean, I guess the reason why I thought it was mischaracterization was because he kneeled to respect. Out of respect, he kneeled. Originally he was sitting on the bench and doing other things, but then he went and talked to another guy, another teammate or something, and then he was like, "Oh, okay, I'll kneel instead." And so I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's a good question about, is that like a mischaracterization, or is that just sort of like putting it in more stark terms? Because I think that Colin, from what I understand, that he doesn't respect doesn't want to show respect to the flag and the anthem of a country which he sees as being racist. That's sort of his objection, and in particular about police brutality. But why, for example, why isn't he like, if all he's doing is protesting police brutality, why doesn't he start a charity against police brutality, or why doesn't he write an editorial to the newspaper? The form of his protest is the flag, the national anthem is being played, and instead of going like this, like everybody else, I'm gonna take it. I'm gonna get down on a knee and show that I'm doing something else. I'm not
It's way
respecting
more
that
effort.
anthem.
I think that'd be better.
And there's a case where like you might agree with what he's
I don't
doing
know,
there.
maybe that was just my example.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you have a better one, go
No,
ahead.
no. I mean, it's good. The question, sometimes people will put in their case and like sort of try to draw out the principle or deduce something from it, and it may be, it may be inaccurate for some other reason, or but the question is it like an exaggeration, right? So, or is it sort of like a wrong deduction? And it's, when people do symbolic things, I suppose the question is like, it's hard to see what's in their mind or what they're trying to convey to other people if they don't tell you what they're doing. So, how about let's see. Yeah, did you have one? Go ahead.
I think maybe like you could either be a Christian, good values, blah 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 Republican, or you could be a gay supporting, baby hating, blah blah blah.
Right, yeah,
Would
yeah.
that be a strongman argument? Or just like I don't know, I guess an exaggeration.
Yeah, it's kind of like that has some the idea of a straw man. You could say you could be like a patriotic American, or you could be like a America hating
Be strong man cause.
millionaire or something like that.
Oh, gotcha. I see the
Like if
difference.
you
So
say
it's
like
not stating
if you say
fact.
like if you said if that I'm thinking of what would be like not be an ad hominem in this case.
Well, I don't think my example would be an ad hominem.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I'm stating, like, even
Right.
though they're like gross misrepresentations,
Right,
they're
yeah.
not untrue.
Right.
You know, I say baby hating, but really that to them means
Yeah.
pro-choice. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah,
So there's
I had a
concepts that
similar
exist.
I had a similar like exam question they had that was sort of characterized Democrats and Republicans in extremes that don't really fit the parties. So that might be a good example of that. So the
Do you have an example of something that has happened recently?
yeah, something this one's a little old. Like I said, I haven't taught this for a while. I did a little bit about fallacies in my contemporary moral issues class. I think with the straw man, you could like if you characterize like trying to think of a straw man. It's not an ad hominem. Well, like think of like what's in the news, like Jeff Flake. Like Jeff Flake, just had this sort of anti-Trump rant from the hall of the Senate. So if I say Jeff Flake is just an anti-Trump rhino who knows that he stands no chance of winning re-election. Where I think if you mischaracterize him as sort of like a sort of wishy-washy moderate Republican like John McCain, that's not really true. He's actually Jeff Flake is the senator who just said he's not going to run for re-election, and spent I don't know how much, like 5 or 10 minutes calling out President Trump and saying how the Republican Party's going down the tubes and Trump's leading the charge, right? So he made this big speech, and And he doesn't like President Trump. Particularly, he doesn't like his style. He's kind of like a button-down, like, I don't know what you call it, propriety and dignity type Republican, and thinks that President Trump is uncouth and undignified. But Jeff Flake's very very conservative, as opposed to John McCain, who's more like a middle of the road type guy, and votes with the Democrats a lot. Flake votes like 95% with like President Trump and with the conservatives. So if I say, Jeff Flake is just like, he's just one of those rhinos who's being primaried out and knows he has no political future in a conservative GOP or something like that, that would be inaccurate. So I might mischaracterize Jeff Flake, although he is a Trump detractor. I might mischaracterize him as a rhino, Republican in name only, or like as being kind of wishy-washy, as most of the Trump's critics are, in order to try to take away his credibility, right? So that would be an example of a straw man. Sorry for those of you who don't follow politics, might not find that example helpful. I'll see. Next week, I'm going to come up with a bunch of examples. I'll throw them out in class and put them up on the. I'll put them up on the PowerPoint so we can go through them and we can do some drilling to see if you can pin the tail on the fallacy. Let's take our break. 10 minutes. We'll come back and talk about some more different fallacies. Okay, we're back. Go back here. Well, let's talk about something new, the bandwagon fallacy, also known as ad populum. So this has to do with the sort of popular fallacy, and the idea is that everybody's doing this thing, so you should do it too. Or, so it's either everybody's doing this great thing, you should do it too, or everybody does this thing, so you shouldn't feel so bad about doing this morally questionable thing. Often that's what it is. So the sort of more positive version of this, you see this argument like every modern Western industrialized country has government health care. Therefore, the United States should have government health care too. That's a common argument made. And the idea is that just because Western Europe and I suppose Eastern Europe too, and we modern industrialized countries, parts of Latin America, China, Canada, North America, all these countries, they have government health care, that just because they all have it, that there's something wrong with you if you're in the minority. If you're not going along with the crowd, they know something that you don't, and so you should go along with the group. And that's not always the case necessarily. Healthcare is very controversial, but just because every other modern industrialized country has some form of government health care doesn't mean that we should. And you might, in this case, you might question the premise of, what do you mean by government health care? We've got Medicare and Medicaid, which make up a big chunk of the federal budget actually, and those are government health care. So I think the idea of that, and most of the European countries have a parallel private system, like a two-tiered system. But you just take it in sort of overall terms that more, most other countries have a more robust government healthcare system than the U.S. And just because they all have it and we don't, we ought to change to be like them. That's the version of the bandwagon fallacy. Also, you might see this in incarceration policies. There is a negative case where you'd say, well, the U.S. has more prisoners per capita than any modern industrialized country. Or the death penalty. All modern industrialized countries have gotten rid of the death penalty, and the only people that practice it are, fill in the blank with barbaric, ruthless regimes. Or there was another policy thing I was just thinking of: incarceration, the death penalty, healthcare. What else what's something that's the U.S. is unique in?
Is unique in
I just thought of something else and now it's gone.
incarceration?
Incarceration, death penalty. Gun control, right? So almost every modern industrialized country has more strict gun control laws than the U.S. Except for Switzerland, I guess. Yeah.
I was going to say pharmaceutical drug advertisements. Only the U.S. and New Zealand allow as much ads for drugs than other first world nations.
Yeah, drug ads, good.
Oh, lawsuits? Like you can't sue in a lot of other countries?
Oh yeah, United States legal system. We have is one of the most liberal as far as suing people, and is one of the most. We have maybe the most litigious society on the planet. It's kind of funny in countries like Japan, the cream of the crop, the best of the best, they become engineers and scientists, and in America they become lawyers, because that's sort of the top where you can be the top earner and the most influential people. In Japan, it's becoming like a captain of industry and innovation and technology. Kind of sad. So I'll just put lawsuits. And now the thing is, this alone, try to write it more legibly. My A's ran into my W. Lawsuits. We're a lot like ancient Greece. Aristophanes has this comedic play called The Wasps, and talks about like Greek society was like that too. Everybody's always suing everybody else, and there's this couple's got a father who's like, he's like lawsuit crazy. He's like addicted to being a juror. And he always wants to sit on the jury and likes to give the thumbs up or the thumbs down and hear the prosecution, hear the defense, and it's kind of like a lampoon of satire on Greek society and their obsession with lawsuits. And today, I think it's like it's a good commentary on American society. So the question is, if American society is this way and nobody else is, does that necessarily mean it's bad? You can say the same thing with the First Amendment, right? Nobody has more free speech rights in the U.S. than any place else. But does that mean that we should? Does that mean that we should change it to be like everybody else? Or how about this? Every modern industrialized country has restrictions on free speech. Therefore, the U.S. should follow suit, and we should add more restrictions on free speech. I would say that's a bad idea. And the whole question though is, maybe, I mean, you might agree with that. But the idea is, even if it doesn't really matter whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea based on its merits, the question is, just because everybody else is doing it, should you do it? Or because everybody else isn't doing it, is that a reason why you shouldn't be doing it, either as an individual or as a group or a nation? And it seems that, and what the reason the bandwagon is a fallacy, because it plays on this kind of groupthink and herd mentality, right? And this is a part of human nature, where you even have these studies where you have like a bunch of people in a room and you show them a line. I'll mention this. So you show them actually it's two lines. Make these better. And they're asked to say like whether these lines are the same length. Let's see, so the question is, are these lines the same length? And so they have four people in the room who are like plants, and they all say yes, and the fifth is like the person doesn't know that the fix is in. And if you get 3 or 4 people that say yes, or that say no, the lines are different length, the fifth person will go along with them. And it's not even necessarily peer pressure. The fifth person will actually perceive the lines as being different length. It's not, and afterwards they ask the person, like, did you just go along with the group, or did you actually think the lines were different length? And they'd say, oh, I thought maybe there was like a difference between them. But the lines are exactly the same length, right? So there's this sort of herd mentality that's built into human psychology that can lead you astray. Now, sometimes the herd mentality is good. Like, sometimes it could be that you're the one who's like odd man out, and you're, maybe have a situation like that where you're wondering like, why is everybody else like acting one way, I'm acting another way? Or it seems like I'm missing something, everybody else is like, I don't know. Think about like there's a test, like everybody comes into a room and they put their back to the front of the room and put their phone away and sit quietly with a pencil, and you're sitting there with your backpack, sitting in your seat saying, uh-oh, is there an exam today? Or why is everybody doing something different than what I'm doing, right? So sometimes it's useful, or if you see people like, ducking behind objects, maybe there's somebody shooting from a high place or something. Yeah.
Wasn't there like a study that was done where a man stood in front of a door that led nowhere, and then he people started getting in line behind him, and all of a sudden there was a line around the block, and no one knew why they were standing in the line, but they figured if so many people were waiting that it was worth waiting for.
That's interesting, huh? Yeah, so this is a thing where people go along with a group, and this is one of those things. This, I think, is similar to like emotions, where it can raise a question, but you don't just go with it. And what happens is they just go with their feelings without reflecting on like why they're doing it, And this plays into a lot of the ways people, like, their views on issues. They're like, oh no, what does everybody else think? And they don't think for themselves, but they just look around to people around them for their opinions. So the bandwagon plays in on this and tries to, manipulate or persuade you into going along with the group instead of looking at the issue on its merits. And that's why it's a fallacy. And that's why it's bad. All right, so, another example, stealing, there's nothing wrong with stealing office supplies. Everybody does it, right? So even if everybody does steal office supplies, doesn't mean you should steal office supplies. I remember during my first marriage with some guy, I was working security, and this guy's like, talking about some woman he was sweet talking. He's a married guy. I'm like, hey, you said you're married. He's like, hey man, everybody does it. I'm like, that's like you made a promise. I gave him a little lecture. I'm like that's not right. He's like, lighten up, everybody does it, right? I'm like, you guys don't have an open relationship. Oh no, she'd kill me if she found out, right? So, and you look at the statistics for like fidelity in marriage, they're like, down really low. It turns out that what he said, maybe it's an exaggeration. Everybody doesn't do it, but like you have infidelity is a popular sport in America. And even at the time it was, but just because lots of other people are doing it doesn't mean it's okay for you to do it. Same thing with like cheating. You look at like numbers of students who admit to cheating, and then you maybe inflate that a little bit about the ones that are like fibbing about it because they feel guilty or they're worried about that this is a trick to catch cheaters or something. Don't want to admit it because they're worried about getting caught, right? So even if you get like big swatches of students that admit cheating in the last year, 20-25% of college students or something like that, doesn't mean it's okay for you to cheat. Lack of proportion. So lack of proportion it's a kind of like a bad argument by analogy where you compare something to something else, and you try to present the two cases as similar when they're vastly out of proportion. So this case of female circumcision comes up. I put it in quotes there. It's called the preferred term is FGM, female genital mutilation, where they cut off part or all of the clitoris, remove and sew up the vaginal lips, and it's a pretty nasty procedure. And so often you'll hear a retort, which is like, well, what about male circumcision? Don't we practice that in the U.S. and does that make us just as bad? So what do you think about that as a response?
I mean, they're both kind of a little bit ridiculous. I mean, like, female circumcision, absolutely, but, like, even male circumcision is kind of an obsolete thing nowadays. I mean, it was originally started for religious purposes, right? And, like, there's no real reason for it to happen.
I don't know, maybe having to do with, like, religious moralism, but not specifically. Oh, so it goes back to Judaism.
That's what I thought.
But the thing is, like, Jews are a small portion of society, and you have, like, Christian Europe doesn't practice it.
Well,
So just, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, it was introduced as a religious concept, and then it was taken on by more, like, institutions because it was thought to be, like, a cleaner thing that was supposed to happen, and that was kind of based on misinformation, and now it's kind of obsolete. Like, none of the research that went into it that made it, like, as big of a craze, I'll say, as it was,
Yeah.
it's just not true.
It goes back to, like, the sort of maybe our Puritan heritage, which is I guess religious, but it has more to do with, like, religious attitudes, particularly about sex. But you compare the two, like one is a minor cutting off the foreskin, which has, like, feeling in it and has nerve endings, and you get some loss of pleasure and sensation. But the analogous case for a male would be what? Be like lopping off the glands or castration or something like that, right? You're talking about, like, taking out the clitoris. Now you can't cut the whole thing out because the clitoris actually is like a long thing that goes into a woman's body, and the part that sticks out is just like the end of it. So you're cutting the end off. So that'd be like cutting out the head of a man's penis, right? And so to compare the one with the other, now you might say, well, okay, circumcision, you might say, well, circumcision's bad, but it's not the same thing. Like, it's not comparable at all.
I mean, like, I guess I should say, like, they're absolutely not the same thing. One is absolutely, in my opinion, amoral, whereas the other one is
Or
more of just like a
immoral.
preferred practice. But like,
You mean immoral?
immoral.
Yeah.
Sorry. Immoral, amoral. I don't know if they're.
Amoral means like out of the category of morality. Neither moral nor immoral.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. But like where they both were based, like the ideas behind both of them are kind of the same. It's like the idea of purity. It's the idea of limiting sensations. So that
Right.
It's not for pleasure or sex. You know, so the
Right.
idea was based in the same concept. That's just a lot more extreme.
It's an excellent observation, and basically the idea is that if boys get like a rash or they're not clean, they might touch their penis. They touch their penis, they might masturbate, and then masturbation is terrible. So in order to keep little boys from masturbating, we're gonna cut off some part of their penis so they're not tempted to touch it. That's sort of going back to like Dr. Kellogg and this sort of like health and Puritanism craze from the 19th century, right? But it's both based on like sort of a puritanical anti-sex attitude, and although I think the female circumcision seems more misogynistic, I suppose, than the male circumcision. It seems misogynistic. I don't know. You had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, never mind.
So anyway, this is like lack of proportion, and this is also a good example of the tu quoque, more Latin words. Tu quoque. Tu quoque means you too. You do it too. Well, even if you do it too, doesn't mean that doing is good, right? So, you made a good point that just because female circumcision is bad, and because we practice male circumcision, or by we I avoid the collective we, because Americans in U.S. hospitals by default, and still by default most of the time will do circumcision, although now they'll ask at least. But most the doctors still very often recommend it, and people do it. Just because it's practiced in the U.S. doesn't mean it's a good thing either, right? So, and even if you admit that male circumcision is bad, that doesn't mean that female circumcision isn't bad also. So in a way, it's kind of it's an irrelevant thing where you say, well, okay, somebody points out a bad thing, and you say, let's not pay attention to this bad thing, let's pay attention to this other bad thing, right? So it's a way to kind of, in a way, this is related to the red herring we'll talk about in just a minute. So, you can go to, let's see, noscirc.org. You go on more information on male circumcision and why it's completely unnecessary, barbaric custom.
Apparently 81% of men 14 to 59 are circumcised.
80 what percent?
81?
Wow, in the U.S.? Yeah, it's still pretty big numbers, right?
Are or aren't?
Oh.
Are?
Are, yeah, that's not the case in like Western Europe. It's largely not practiced. And there's not like an epidemic of like, infections or whatever that Dr. Kellogg thought would happen. Okay, red herring. I'm hitting a lot. This is the last day on fallacies, so I want to make sure I hit them all. The red herring. This is a case where you try to take somebody off the trail of an argument. So the red herring is when you mention something or invoke something that's irrelevant to the argument in order to distract from the point. So you take somebody off their point and try to point them some other direction. And this comes from the training scent hounds. So you train dogs to hunt animals, and you give them a scent of the animal, or I suppose a person if you're trying to catch an escaped prisoner or something like that. And then they sniff the whatever article of clothing for the prisoner, or they get a scent of like the animal, and they try to pick up the trail of the animal on the ground. And when you're training a scent hound, one of the things they do is they take like an old rotten fish, which to dogs are the most delicious thing in the world, and they take it and they drag it across the trail and off in another direction. And if you train the hounds properly, they'll follow the scent that they've been given. They won't get distracted by this yummy, delicious rotten fish that they want to eat and go off to the side, right? And what you're trying to do with the red herring, if you're the one making the fallacy, is you're trying to draw the person off the scent and off in some other direction and away from the argument they're trying to make. I heard this on the abortion protest, where one of the things that the so you had the counter protesters said, well, what about children that are born? Why aren't these people supporting poor children in America who are born? Or what about starving kids overseas? So that's a red herring, because the point of issue is whether a fetus has a right to life. It's not about like taking care of children. Now they're related, right? So the question is, but you could say that about anything. Like suppose somebody's out there, they're PETA activists, right? And they're saying don't eat meat, don't support factory farms. And you say, oh, you care so much about animals. What about the children? You're focusing on and animals when there are all these hungry children out there, children that need to eat and need to eat meat or whatever, right? So, or suppose it's an anti-war protest and you say, oh, you're protesting war, but what about all the starving children? Well, it's irrelevant, right? Well, in the same way with the abortion, even though it's children that you're talking about, so it might seem relevant, the fact that if it's a fact that the abortion protesters aren't helping children who are born, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be helping children that aren't born, right? So that'd be an example of the red herring. So it's an attempt to distract from the issue. And take off the lead off the trail. Or the scent of the argument, right? You sort of like distract them and bring them off in some other area, into the weeds, as we say, right? So, and that's what they do. They take this fish and they drag it off to the side and into the weeds, and if the dogs weren't being trained properly, they go run after the fish and end up in the weeds instead of following the trail. And they think, okay, we got to train these dogs better to stay on the trail and stay on the scent. So, and as a matter of fact, it turns out that the anti-abortion activists actually run crisis pregnancy centers and help women that want to keep their babies, through pregnancy and beyond, and help with, housing and clothing and food and all the rest. So, but even if they didn't, it wouldn't matter, because they're not they're a group. They're not about trying to save the lives or improve the quality of life of children who are born. They're about saving the lives of the unborn. And just because you care about the lives of the unborn doesn't mean that you have to put time and resources into children that are born. So that's a red herring, example of a red herring. Can anybody think of another example of a red herring? Argument you had, or yeah.
Like you're trying to mention a gun control, you say a registry or something like that, and all of a sudden everyone uses the buzzword gun ban. They love jumping to ban. It's like no one's talking about banning anything, but they'll jump straight to ban when you mention any sort of regulation, background check, straight to ban. Like they'll be like, well, how is banning guns gonna help? It's like, don't go there, we're not over there.
So that sounds more like the next one we're going to talk about. All these fallacies, they sort of, they overlap in some ways. So in some ways that sounds like the straw man, where you're kind of exaggerating the person's position. So the person's not really in favor of banning, they're in favor of registration. And the person typically, let's say, well, first registration, then it's confiscation, right? You have the one before the other. And that's the example of what's called the slippery slope. Now, the slippery slope, you argue that one beginning step will lead to these subsequent steps, and sometimes there's just like 2 or 3, and then finally we'll end up in some bad consequence. So the idea is if you allow registration, then next thing you know, there'll be confiscation. Or if you say you can't, have a gun if you're mentally ill or have a criminal background, pretty soon you're not going to be able to have a gun if I don't know, some other minor reason, like you're not going to be able to have a gun at all, I guess. So the slippery slope says if you sort of start down this path, you're going to slide all the way down to the bottom and nothing's going to stop you. Where it may be that if you just have some basic checks on registration and background check and try to make sure people aren't crazy or criminals, that maybe this kind of gun control will work just fine, along with maybe some safety lessons or something. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Too quick way, straw man, left proportion. Ad hominem. Let's get back here a minute. Straw man. One thing I just like to say about these fallacies in general, that there is some overlap, but and sometimes more than one fallacy apply, but typically one of those fallacies is gonna fit the best. So if you have a red herring, is sort of distracting from the issue, but in another way, it's like talking about the person's character is distracting from the issue too, right? Like, suppose I'm going to quote from I think of some person whose character might be in question. Harvey Weinstein.
Martin Heidegger.
What's that?
Martin Heidegger.
Oh, Martin Heidegger. Yeah, like so. Like if someone says Martin Heidegger has some really interesting things to say about artificial intelligence, and someone else were to respond, Martin Heidegger, he was a Nazi, he supported the Nazi Party. That would be so that would be, you might say, oh, that's a red herring, because whether Heidegger is a Nazi or not has nothing to do with whether he has some interesting things to say about artificial intelligence. But really this fits better, it fits the ad hominem argument, which is trying to draw someone away from the argument based on an irrelevant fact of the person's character, as opposed to looking at the argument itself. So you wouldn't like dismiss Martin Heidegger right out of hand just because he was a Nazi. Yeah.
Would one be like, if I were to claim like climate change exists, and then someone else was like, but the oil industry gives us so much profit in America, that would be a red herring, right? Because they're trying to like kind of pull away from the issue, whereas like oil still has a really big effect on climate change, and like there's all these different environmental disasters that can happen. That's really not what I'm arguing about climate change, not like the oil industry's effect on the economy of America. You know what I mean?
That's a really interesting case in point. So the climate change is a big problem.
So you'd be like, whoever's whoever's like for climate change or is like trying to do something about climate change is like against individual work communism, like you have to forego your cars and take public transportation now because you're trying to get rid of gas, which means you have to shrink gas, but you can't just sell gas to people, so it's like, you would dissuade from the fact that there's like climate change because you want to be like, well, how the hell are you gonna get to work? Is everybody gonna walk to work? Because it sounds like everybody's gonna get really hot and start heating up the atmosphere running to work all the time.
So the question is, like, is this a fallacy? So like, someone says climate change is a big problem. We need to reduce the fossil fuel use. So again, you maybe implied the conclusion of this argument: climate change is a big problem. The conclusion. I got this mixed around. So the conclusion is we should reduce fossil fuel use. Why? Because climate change is a big problem. Understood premise. If we reduce fossil fuel use, climate change will be less of a problem, or we will be addressing climate change, right? And then someone else might say, but oil is the lifeblood of the economy, and maybe some implied things there with without it, our economy will suffer terribly and will be and it will suffer economic deprivation. So the question is that a fallacy? And this is a case where it seems like the person's really mounting a counter argument. They're not really mischaracterizing the other person's position. They're not necessarily trying to distract them and push them off another direction, but they're addressing a related problem.
Yeah, when you put in the fossil fuel use premise, it is. But like,
Right.
if I were to just say climate change is a big problem, like the oceans are heating up.
Yeah.
And then someone was like, but oil's the lifeblood of the economy. Wouldn't that be more of a red? Because you're right, that would be a counter argument. But
Even though it's
Okay.
an argument, it's still like saying that just because I'm saying there's a problem with climate change.
Okay, I see what you
like,
mean.
I'm
So
anti-economic.
this is so this is okay, but then an illegitimate thing might be
Criticizing you for being
climate change
yeah,
is
like
occurring. Now, maybe I'm reading into a bunch of stuff about this, like that climate change is caused by human, industrial production, and the burning of fossil fuels. Like, it seems like it's implied with that.
Okay.
I mean, it's part of like the climate change theory. I mean, it depends on what you mean by climate change. Usually, when people say climate change, they mean what's so-called anthropogenic global warming, like that man caused heating up of the planet based on industrial production.
Yeah.
Um,
So are you saying that like it would be an implied premise that it would
The
kind
fossil
of like
fuels
create
are
its own
causing the
implied
climate to
premises
warm.
of that?
Yeah, I'd say like, climate change is occurring. You might cast out, well, what do you mean, is it getting colder? Are we headed to the new ice age? Like, some people think that's the case, but that's not what a person means when they say climate change is occurring. They mean industrial pollution is causing the temperatures to warm.
So then how would we make that, like, what would a red herring be, like, for that situation? Because, like, I feel like every time I try and go on to, like, what a red herring would be,
Yeah.
I'm getting it confused with, like, if I say climate change is occurring, he says fossil fuels are an issue, or they run the economy,
Yeah.
then that's a counter argument, and since it has some kind of relative anything with it, what is
Okay, how about like,
Well, because there are possible ways around coal and burning of fossil fuels to continue the economy without,
yeah, it just kind of seems like you're trying to, like,
solar,
disprove my point with
wind.
something that's very easily.
You could have solar energy terminals to profit off of before distributing all the solar power you collected, at the very least. I mean, you can, the same way as collecting oil, there's the positive one versus the other.
So if somebody says something like, I'm not writing the best, that would be a red herring. Like if they're, because the whole idea is I'm not gonna ride the loser cruiser, just because the planet's supposedly warming. So the idea is that climate change is occurring, like, so you're addressing, like, you're opening the question about whether the climate's changing or not, and maybe whether it's due to industrial pollution, but whether this person is willing to ride the bus or not and make a personal sacrifice is kind of irrelevant.
But now that's the argument.
Yeah,
He's
they're
trying to
like
make.
distracting you, talking about like how painful is it to ride the bus?
Okay, I can see
That
that.
riding the bus is dangerous to so many unknown people with germs and flus. We're just gonna make each other sick.
Yeah, so it's a distraction, and I don't know, maybe that's not,
It
I've heard
sounds like
people
that other
talking
thing,
about climate
like
change these
the
days.
ad hominem thing. I don't know, it sounds like it's more of like like just kind of a off the wall, doesn't mean anything, like not even really, it's not
Yeah.
even really an argument, like you're not gonna argue with him about riding the bus, like it's just a statement, it doesn't even seem.
well, it's not,
anything.
it's just missing, how climate change is occurring, what would be a red herring, I'm thinking of a red herring that wouldn't be like an ad hominem. What if I would say like, well, you know, Harvey Weinstein believes in climate change, and he's a rapist. That would be like a that's actually one more I wanted to mention, which is guilt by association, and it's also an ad hominem. But here, I think with the if you distract from the issue of the red herring, if you talk about what might be something that might be somewhat related to climate change, but not exactly on point about whether or not climate change is occurring. Yeah.
Someone told me this the other day. Someone was like, "Yeah, I'm not gonna stop eating red meat.
Mm-hmm.
Stop eating cow."
Yeah, that'd be similar to. Oh, how about like if the person would say
Oh,
meat eating is a major producer of carbon or something.
no, okay, but I definitely think I think that is a good example.
Then you get into talking about like vegetarianism or something like that. And the person's saying, well, you should be, if you believe in climate change, you should be a vegetarian. And you get into like the ethics of meat eating and whether meat eating is climate change, well, as opposed to whether or not climate change is occurring or not. Now, the person might not even believe in climate change. They're just trying to lure you into a discussion. And maybe, maybe they're trying to do like, they might end up making a reductio argument. They would say, well, if climate change is as bad as you think, then everybody should become a vegan to stop climate change. But obviously that's ridiculous. So therefore, you know, climate change isn't happening. That would be a fallacy, right? Anyway, but that might be a case where, so the basic idea of the red herring, you're trying to draw somebody off the beaten path onto a side issue. Now, usually it's not completely irrelevant. Like if you say climate change is occurring, and I say, what's that new movie that's out? There's a great new movie out called, I'm trying to think of what that promos I saw. Suburbia. Have you seen it? Like that's just like, you know, I'm just changing the subject, so that's not red herring. So if I say, have you seen that new movie with Matt Damon? You know, that's not a fallacy. It's just I'm changing the subject. But if you say climate change is occurring, and I say, and I mention a related subject, and I'm sort of pretending to address it, but I'm sort of drawing you off to the side into some side issue, then that's the red herring. I'll see if I can come up with like a list of examples of this. This is kind of a hard one. I'm not sure why. Like to decide what's relevant here. Anybody else have any ideas on this one?
Without ad hominem, I don't know, that's tough. I keep attacking the person I'm trying to distract from.
It's fun. All right, so you could say, now, like what would be, okay, it would be a straw man response to this. So it says climate change is a problem, and we should reduce our use in fossil fuels.
anyone who doesn't believe in climate change is a hillbilly.
Yeah, so that'd be like actually that'd be ad hominem.
Wait, yeah.
Yeah, because you're using the characteristic.
It might be that's more like the ad hominem because you're like calling names.
You just asked for an ad hominem.
Did I?
I
I
thought
asked
so.
for a straw man.
Yeah,
Oh, maybe I was confusing the two.
So this.
Oh, straw man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one's like,
Like a straw man might be, if we're up to you, we'd all be living in yurts, eating organic vegetables, and sleeping in the dark, shivering under our hemp blankets or something. Right? So I take like this idea that we should adjust climate change with. I sort of try to paint you as a Luddite who wants to get rid of all industrial production. That would be a straw man. What was the one I said I was just going to talk about? Guilt by association. So suppose someone were to say, oh, I heard Hillary Clinton the other day talking about the president. I thought she had some really interesting things to say about his policies, and then gives you 2 or 3 points about that Hillary Clinton's made in the last few days, and you're to say Hillary Clinton, she got millions of dollars from that rapist Harvey Weinstein, and her husband's a rapist too, right? That would be guilt by association. Also ad hominem maybe. Whether or not she got millions of dollars from a person who's committed sexual assault has nothing to do with the arguments she'd made, right? So you'd have to look at the particular arguments that she'd made about President Trump, and to see whether they're valid or not. But whether or not she got millions so the idea is that I try to distract from whatever she said and say, look, she's a bad person because she's associated with Harvey Weinstein, who's a bad person, right? And she's a bad person because her husband is a bad person. But that is totally irrelevant to what argument she made. It's similar to the ad hominem, but instead of attacking the person themselves, you attack someone who's associated with them and then try to carry over the guilt. Say, oh, anybody who's associated with this person has to be a bad person too. And so you should ignore what they have to say. And this is also a common thing you see in politics, guilt by association. An easy one to make because they're usually all guilty of something if you're a politician. I think that's, I got 5 minutes left here. I think I've hit all the big major fallacies. Any questions about any of these so far? And there's our 5-minute warning.
could you give another example of straw man?
Sure. Let's see. Let me think about some particular issue that's in the news here, or some. Think about a really egregious use of the straw man. It's one of those things that's super common. I think it's something we haven't talked about so far. I can use it like an original example. So anytime you exaggerate another person's position, and then maybe think of a non-political example. It's common to you can think of an example. Go ahead.
Like, hey mom, I want to have a sleepover. Oh, so you want to go hang out with all those harlots that you know from school who are going to be smoking drugs and talking about boys and sex? Is that thing?
Yeah, that might be like a straw man if it's kind of an argument the question is like, was one have a sleepover, is that really an argument? You could say something like, you know, Mom, I'm a responsible, you know, young adult now, or something like that. I'm 16. Or whatever, I'm a responsible young teen, and I should be able to get together with my friends, and she might say, oh, you're just looking to smoke dope and to have boys over, or something like that. I suppose, I'm not sure that's like a mischaracterization of an argument, though. Yeah.
I remember it was a city council meeting and they were deciding whether or not to pass a moratorium on recreational cannabis sales. And during citizen comments on the issue, one of the ladies walks up and says, and her previous issue was pit bulls, whether they should ban pit bulls because stigma's real. And so she goes up during the cannabis issue and says, well, if you want to see a bunch of drug dealers start owning pit bulls all over town, this and that, is that a straw man, just like exaggerating? Like, you know, they're gonna come in, take over the buildings, buy all the tough dogs, intimidate everyone.
That might be more of like a slippery slope argument.
Okay.
Because you're saying that this one little change will lead to these cascading bad effects and lead to some disastrous situation. I think a good example of like that might be though, like let's legalize marijuana, and you could say, oh, so you want like you know, kids smoking dope out in front of this preschool, is that what you want? Right, so that would be like mischaracterizing the person who, you know, that if they're in favor would probably want like, you know, age checks and you know, anybody who supported the cannabis legalization wanted age checks and regulations and taxes and the various kinds of controls. So nobody's supporting, you know, like preschoolers smoking dope or being able to sell dope in front of the preschool. Right. Okay, and that's all we have time for. We'll get right into critical thinking about religion and ethics on Tuesday.